Hi, welcome to a very special episode of Zelf on the Shelf. Today we are joined by none other than internet vegan legend Mike the Vegan, who is going to enlighten us with some takes on both veganism and the Great Salt Lake crisis that we Utahns are really worried about right now. Mike, thank you so much for joining us. This is such a pleasure to have you.
Glad to be here, absolutely. Yay! I'm so excited to talk to people just from a long distance, always. It's just fun with technology, and yeah, the Great Salt Lake is something we definitely need to talk about, so let's do it.
Now, you're not Utah-based, are you?
Oh no, that was just totally random that I started talking about that. I just end up talking about stuff everywhere. Anywhere there's some problem, I'll probably end up talking about it, even if it's not. I'm actually in Iowa, and I occasionally talk about local Iowa issues, like how we have at least 7 times as many pigs as people, a ton of factory farms. It's all pretty messed up, but today we can talk about Utah.
Thank you so much. It means a lot that someone from Iowa would care.
I've been watching Mike's videos for years, but he just dropped an amazing video about the Great Salt Lake crisis that goes really in depth into all the research about what's causing it. We're going to cover kind of the main points today, but we'll link that video in the description box. Highly recommend sharing it around, watching it, doing all the things. Should we start out with you telling us a little bit about your background, how you got into veganism and YouTube, just for anyone who isn't familiar with you?
Yeah, so I started, it was at least 7 years ago, and I've been vegan for like 10 plus years, and basically my partner's been vegan for 15 years. Was feeding me some good vegan food, so I was getting open to it, and then she handed me the China study on a road trip, read the whole thing because it was like cross country, and then I decided to go vegan right then and there. And then the next restaurant we went to was like a diner where it was a really bad place to be vegan, and we still managed to pull off like pasta and green beans and stuff like that. So that was my first official full vegan meal. However, I was afraid that I wasn't going to get enough protein, so I kept eating fish really occasionally for like 3 months, and then finally I realized that I did not need to do that at all, and then went fully vegan. And then a few years later, after researching a ton of stuff, everyone was like, you should say what you just researched in a YouTube video. And by the third person saying that, I was like, fine, I'll try one. And so I made one and it got like 0 views. I made another one, it got like 2 views. And so I just decided, I'm just gonna keep making these for myself. And then finally Happy Healthy Vegan shared one of my videos, and then it's history from there.
Do you have a background in environmental science, you said in your Great Salt Lake video?
It's sustainability. So a bachelor's of science and like sustainability. So I do definitely focus on those issues, and that was a major motivator for me, even though there wasn't really as much information out when I first went vegan on the environmental effects of animal agriculture. It was way before Cowspiracy. There were some reports out, but it wasn't quite as much there. And so I'm happy to just see all the information grow and the problems sort of being eliminated.
Yeah, my grandma was vegan since the 70s, before people knew what it was. And I remember she would get like these vegan, it was just like the main vegan organization in the UK. She would like get their little magazine every month, and it was really cute.
Yeah, the Vegan Society started in the 50s. So there's been people that have been doing it, and it is crazy. I applaud those people because I was very hard to convince, and that's why I needed to read so much research before going vegan. And so those people, good on them for like just doing it without a lot of research. I mean, they had inspiration from very, very plant-based cultures around the world, like the Jains and stuff like that, seeing them not just like dropping dead. But yeah, it's good on them.
It is interesting though, because I remember my grandma telling me that the reason she went fully vegan is she thought, or she basically just saw some documentary that said that veganism uses less land, and once she heard that, like the switch flipped. So I'm like, the information has been out there to some degree.
Oh yeah, we've known a little bit. I mean, there's been like smaller reports, like obviously they can just calculate how much feed an animal is eating. Somebody probably did that versus how much a person would need to eat, and then they can just look at yield per land. Like there were things like that, but we didn't know the major greenhouse gas emission things we have from like the FAO, which came, I think Livestock's Long Shadow was like 2007 or 2009. And before that, we probably had some greenhouse gas emissions report, but none of them that I know of were like global reports. So yeah, they had their ear to the ground about the environmental effects.
I'm kind of wanting you to give sort of an elevator pitch for veganism for people watching who maybe are skeptical or vegan curious. Maybe we could just specifically focus on sort of the environmental side of it at first, but what are sort of like the main points you tend to hit people with when, you know, they ask why you are vegan?
Well, the most important thing if you do believe in climate change, which thankfully it's mostly a U.S. problem, people denying it. Well, not only there, but assuming you believe in climate change, the biggest concern is greenhouse gas emissions, obviously, because if we heat up the earth too much, then we have a cascade of horrible effects, in which case, you know, we could reach a point where it's not very habitable, which we really don't want to do. So greenhouse gas emissions, in my opinion, the most important thing. And so we have the FAO report that I talked about, Livestock's Long Shadow, which pinned animal agriculture as the single leading cause of greenhouse gas emissions. Then the FAO came out with another 2014 report, which lessened it a little bit. So it went from, I believe, like 18 to 14.5% to be a little conspiracy-ish. Between that time, they did partner with the International Meat Secretariat and the International Dairy Federation. I'm going to say that didn't affect anything. Maybe it did. We don't know. The point is, you can accurately say, based off FAO reports, that it is either the leading or one of the top leading greenhouse gas emitters. And so that is really important. It is also a major spewer of methane, which is really powerful over about 10 or 20 years. In 10 years, I think it's about 100 times as powerful as CO2. And so we really don't want to be spewing that, yet all of these ruminants that we're farming are letting a lot of that out. They're belching a ton of it out. And that's the point, again, because everyone's like, oh, we can just go grass-fed and it'll be fine. Those grass-fed animals emit over 3 times as much methane as grain-fed animals. I'm not pro-grain-fed. I'm not pro any of this stuff. But it's worth mentioning that a lot of the solutions there are greenwashed. And so beyond the greenhouse gas emissions, which I think are the most important, we also have things like livestock using 1/3 of the Earth's fresh water. And in terms of food security, from the UN, it was up to half of the world's grain. I've heard another one that said over half of our crops. So it's around there. And then we also have, 30% of our ice-free land is being used that way. In fact, in the lower 48 of the United States, it's approximately half of all of our land is being used for either grazing livestock or growing feed for livestock. So we're just using so much of it. And that might be a good segue into the Utah issues, because that is exactly the issue, if you want to talk about it.
Yes, please.
I thought your video was so fascinating because we have these billboards up in Utah right now that say Utah is in a drought, use less water, which, I'm all for. But I definitely didn't expect, like, did you say it was something like 86% of water use from the Great Salt Lake is...
Of agriculture water. Yeah, I can just go over the numbers real quick. So we saw all of these reports in the news that, they said it was climate change, and I do believe climate change plays a role. We can talk about that in a second. And there is a big drought. That is also true. But a lot of them, would briefly mention that agriculture is using a lot of water, and then they would leave it at that. And some people even said, yes, agriculture is using the vast majority of water. They would just leave it at that. But if you actually break it down, yes, agriculture, from a 2019 report based off, I think it was a Utah Division of Water Resources data, it is 82% of all water is going to agriculture. And then if you look at USDA data, break that down, at least 86% of that, the number that you remembered, is going to feed animals and go to watered pastures. And then there's another 10% of that that's like seeds and grains and stuff, which is soy and corn and all other crops. Really ambiguous, but it could be close to 95% based off just how much crops we feed to animals. It could be, my guess is between 90 and 95% of ag water. So we're at very minimum 70% of all of Utah's water is going to livestock. Possibly 80% is going to that. So that is pretty insane, and it's diverting water that would go directly into the Great Salt Lake. They're just right on the river. You can just look at these operations that are just way too green. Dairy operations, alfalfa in particular is the main water sink there. It's just sucking up, I think, 46% of the ag water for a single crop. And all the just farm animals in the desert or farm animal feed in the desert. Some of it is going even all the way to China and stuff. So it's it's kind of crazy. It's not the best decision.
Yeah, on the alfalfa thing, one of my friends is sort of in like the environmental world, and she said a lot of Utah farmers don't even care about growing alfalfa, but they have to grow it to retain their water rights. So they're essentially just wasting water on a crop they don't even care to be growing just so they can like keep access to that water. Have you heard that?
So that's why I'm glad I'm talking to somebody who's local, because there's definitely nuanced issues like that I can't easily see from just researching top-down stuff, scientific papers on the internet. You're not going to have, maybe, sometimes that stuff will come up, but in general it doesn't. And then we also have to mention what the really bad effects of the lake draining are, and that is that it's 70% exposed in terms of the lake bed, and then the lake bed has toxic arsenic and other dust on it, which can, or potentially dust. It has basically just high levels of heavy metals because it's a terminal lake. Everything flows in and nothing flows out. That's why it's 5 times saltier than the ocean. And so if we have 70% of that exposed and then we have a dust storm, then you can have a really big issue. And there have been dust storms, and then there's 1.7 million people right in that area. So we're talking about a potentially, carcinogenic dust issue that, if it isn't mitigated, then I think could lead to like pretty large scale evacuations because it's just, a lot of this has just become exposed. This is a couple decades, and some of it's just been exposed in the last couple of years. And so if we get the wrong storms, or like people go out on their dune buggies and like do frickin' donuts and stuff, they break up the crust, and then that can create dust issues. And so there's a lot of potential problems. And then to just keep rambling, people who say, oh, this isn't going to be a big deal, need to look to Owens Lake in California, which was drained, I think it was like 1916. They started draining it over a decade to give LA water, and that dried up completely in about a decade, and then exposed what was the largest PM10 air pollution source in the US, and PM10 is just any particles under 10 microns. And so we have that also being an arsenic related issue. So just horrible situation where they spent $2.5 billion to basically cover it in gravel and mitigate the dust that way. And then the Great Salt Lake bed is 30 times larger. So I mean, I don't like to be too apocalyptic, but like they need to do something. Like if they just stop animal agriculture, they can return well over 1 trillion gallons of water a year on a normal year. We had a drought this year, but that would help a lot with the lake level. It could fill right back up.
And due to, Utah's geological formations, we get really bad inversion already. We already have air quality that's comparable to like Shanghai and Beijing, some of the worst air quality in the world, because it just sits here. And now with this arsenic threat, it's genuinely terrifying to live here, and anticipating the toll that's going to take on health. And as you mentioned in your video, the animal agriculture is not even bringing in really any money.
3%, isn't it? 3% of economy.
It's not like it's helping us.
Yeah.
Yeah, less than 3%. Good memory. It's crazy. And then it's really good that you mentioned the inversion, because that was the one thing my video started getting a little long. And I did not mention the inversion, which if you want to talk about it a little bit, you can.
Oh, that's pretty much it. It's just
terrifying.
Yeah, you can see it and just be like, oh my goodness, there's no way this is good, and it's not. You can see the data that it's definitely affecting people's health.
Yeah, and it's very scary that all of this is happening in a state that has historically and presently is kind of indifferent to environmental issues, because Utah is a state with a lot of religious zealousness, which has kind of lent itself to republicanism, which has lent itself to, we don't care about the environment, Jesus is going to come back before we need to worry about that. But it seems like he might not, because this stuff is happening now. The arsenic is exposed now. Where is he?
It seems like he isn't here right now. Oh man, yeah, that's a huge thing we can talk about in a bit, but I also just want to explain for people that don't know what an inversion is, and for me to completely clarify. So you have these mountains around it, and you get certain wind patterns that basically just blow air directly down and doesn't let air out, right? And so you have pollution that can get trapped there, and then people end up breathing it more and more. So that's the inversion. They also did a ton of really interesting stuff. Like, I should just say that the scientists that mapped this out were super dedicated. They've been doing it for years. They've been blowing the whistle on this for years. And just because we had that bad drought, thankfully people have been like, oh my God, this is a thing. But basically the local, university scientists have been going with the little dust machine all around the entire lake, mapping the whole thing out in sections, lake bed, I should say. and measuring arsenic levels, measuring lead levels, and all of that, and measuring zones that are potentially dust issues. And it is bad. You can see right up against the population, there's just like a red strip of like potential a dust storm area. And so, you know, people have been doing work on this, and it's sad that people aren't listening. I think they might start listening now that it's been more in the mainstream news, because I've seen, you know, I guess until it's on Fox. I don't know if Fox is gonna do it. Oh man, yeah, you guys. Oh, sorry.
We're up against a lot.
And like you said in your video, you know, you've got these people who are like, this is just our way of life. And it's like, none of us are going to have a way of life if this is the only way of life that's being perpetuated in our collective system. And it's crazy that we're allocating so much resources, especially at a time when, you know, so much of us feel powerless in the face of what's happening in the world, especially with climate change. You know, another big contributor is like the military. And it's like, nothing I ever personally do is going to limit the power of the military. Like, I'm just not going to sign up and that's it. But animal agriculture is something that literally everybody can do, even if it's like not going vegan straight away and just trying to reduce what you're doing. Even that is like something positive that can be done, which I think is really inspiring.
Yes, the single, like something you can, like, perfect example, going back to when I read that China study and went vegan, like that was immediately the moment I almost entirely no longer started contributing to animal agriculture. So at least from a personal footprint, I could just check that box of like, one of the main, if not the main emitter, is no longer something that I'm directly funding, at least. And then when we get enough people doing that, we can change the entire pattern. Because I do know people saying like, one person isn't going to make a difference. Well, a lot of one people's, when you add them up, will then change entire consumption habits. And we've seen that happen with dairy. Unfortunately, they keep subsidizing dairy and like basically farming more and then spilling it, and then they're just like either pouring it out when they have extra or just like creating a giant cheese storage facility. Like like they have all these things that they do that they just keep wanting to produce, because in their mind it's just like a temporary low, but over time it'll balance out. But it's really just a ton of people moving away from dairy because of the negative health effects and the negative animal effects and environmental and on and on and on. So it is kind of annoying that there's a delay where like the government will literally pay to keep contributing to it. But you know, hopefully things will change and people are, you know, buying more alternative fake, or I should say faux meats and all that stuff. And you know, we got Oatly and in Starbucks and stuff and all that, which is great.
So I'm sure you've done entire videos on this, but what I kind of want to again get your sort of short response to, what do you say to people who have sort of bought into the idea of like regenerative agriculture, or, you know, basically just ideas around we can keep eating meat, we're just gonna do it in this other way that magically doesn't hurt the environment?
Oh, for sure. That brings me back to the greenwashing, which there's several things wrong with it. First of all, I'm going to have an entire video on it that people can watch if they want to know all of the details and all the studies that are linked directly there. But basically, we have a few issues. First of all of the studies on that massively undercount methane. I think they had like the White Oaks pasture one, which was like, obviously, I think that's like funded sort of by Kellogg, and you know, it's just a massive greenwashing operation. But they, even in that report, I believe they mentioned what is probably the biggest point, and that is if you get everything going perfectly well in your pasture system, you're raising these animals, after about a decade, those systems no longer are able to store carbon in the soil. You have soil carbon saturation limit that becomes reached, and then they're just continuing to spew methane. So not only do you have the methane spew massively emitting more than whatever carbon they're finding that they sequester when the systems are done at the best that they can even do to get that carbon to be sequestered at all, then they're still spewing that methane, which is over 100 years, I believe it's 32 times as powerful as CO2. And then again, we care about the 10 years where it's 100 times as powerful as CO2. And it can't, and another thing that's really important is that when we're talking about CO2 emissions, only about 45% of those make it into the atmosphere because of the ocean sucking it up and the trees sucking it up. But with methane, essentially 100% of it is making it up into the atmosphere. You could say there's these methanotropes or whatever in the soil that they may be able to suck like a tiny bit, but then that's just like going up into the atmosphere. And so that's another huge thing that they tend to not do the calculation on. So we have a few things that are happening. And then, of course, all of the claims of anything good happening are directly from the industry. And so it's a massive marketing campaign. And there's also people, like, first of all, I believe that there is no sustainable animal farming system, especially with ruminants where you're spewing that methane. But then people who believe in those are generally not, they're just using it as an excuse. Like, they might go to the farmer's market and buy what they think is really good beef or something, and then just keep eating all of the worst factory farm stuff across the board, and then forget that they did or pretend that they're not doing it. Like, that's why if somebody's just stopping eating meat, they're gonna 100% not be contributing to that anymore, which is good. But there is a major danger also to believing that grazing is what's going to save the world, and that brings me to the Alan Savory thing, which is just, again, for all those reasons, completely backwards. It's just over and over again, just seeing it not do what he says it's going to do. And it's the main cause of one of the main causes of desertification in the world and deforestation. And then he's saying that you can regreen the desert and stuff, and just the inputs don't make sense. And like, for example, at Polyface Farm, they're like, oh, we're regenerative and we got this like polyculture of different animals grazing and stuff, and then you find out they're shipping in like 10,000 pounds of grain a year, and that way they're able to like boost, add carbon to the system or whatever. I've never seen it where there isn't some major hole, and that again, whether it's the soil carbon saturation, just not counting the methane or undercounting the methane, and on and on and on. Like, it's just a million issues.
Yeah, it seems like people kind of just get this vague idea in their head that there is a way to do it that is better, and then that kind of keeps them at peace with their decisions and nothing changes.
Oh, for sure. It's just like a little confirmation bias. It's sort of like, I don't know, like hearing that there's a car that's really efficient and then still driving your Land Rover. Like, it's not, and it's just not a widespread solution, and it's still the main contributor. Like, we can sequester really well. If you want to switch to a good protein, start eating more nuts. A lot of nuts are already just carbon negative, just based off the tree planting system. I mean, I could put a link to that chart below, but it's incredible that we already have something that's carbon negative, and we can make other farming carbon negative. Like, if they're talking about this sort of like heavenly best case scenario of animal farming. Well, just making some small changes in a lot of these plant farming methods as well can go really carbon negative and truly carbon negative. And then again, we have the tree crops that are already often carbon negative. Not always. I mean, like, if you're spraying a ton and using some type of fertilizer and on, then it's not going to be. But nuts oftentimes are.
In your video, what was the position that rancher guy was appointed to?
I believe his last name was Ferry, a local rancher who was made, I believe, the head of the DNR, the Department of Natural Resources. And so he's going to be overseeing it. And he is all like, let's make things more efficient. But because he's directly in it, he might help people get some drip irrigation, which it's not going to make the difference that you would need to make to actually do it. I mean, you have to just stop farming what they're farming there. I mean, unless they figured out a way to, like, which they would never do, till it would be like growing feed in greenhouses, which would be insane, and then like giving it to animals, or I don't know, just it's not going to work. Okay,
so moral of the story: cutting out animal products, you would say, is one of the most effective things, or the most effective thing someone in Utah could do to prevent the drying of the Great Salt Lake?
Oh, absolutely. And then, of course, advocating against this and just spreading the word of what's actually doing it. Because people just hear, oh, it's 80% agriculture, 70% agriculture, whichever figure the people are using, and they go, we need food. Like, we have to do that. That's just part of the status quo. And then they don't realize that it's actually for this really, first of all, it's a really small part of the economy. It's not growing food, really any considerable amount of food for you. If you live there, even if you eat meat, probably 90% of your plate in general isn't going to be from Utah, I would guess. And even if, and then if you are eating local, you have a really high, or just it's not even about how high your water footprint is, which would be high. It's about how impactful that water footprint is. And that is that, probably hundreds of gallons. I don't know the data in Utah itself, but probably hundreds of gallons for every burger is, it's leading to the diversion of 100 gallons, maybe a few hundred gallons from the Great Salt Lake itself, if it's local. Probably even more. I have no idea. But because it totally depends on the area. We have, general figures on that.
So Mormonism is the dominant system in Utah, so kind of like everything hinges on the Mormons in a way. It's kind of starting to tip away from that as more people are coming in because of the tech industry and stuff. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Mormonism, but do you know that they actually have a code of health called the Word of Wisdom that tells them to eat meat sparingly, only in winter and times of famine? Have you heard that?
That sounds vaguely familiar. I'm sure I've seen it scrolling through social media of somebody trying to like convince Mormon people that they shouldn't be eating meat. And so that is obviously, I'm not a religious person, but if you were a religious person, perhaps you would believe that the reason that you could be hit with like an apocalyptic toxic dust cloud that's just going to be cycled over and over again onto your population is maybe because you didn't do what you're saying. But I also think that's also a dangerous way of thinking, because then you could think, because there's other religious texts that are like, because I'm not stoning women or something, that I'm getting hit with toxic dust. Like, I don't think that's a good way to think. This is why I think empirically, we don't know everything. Like, I will go ahead and say, like, I am agnostic. Like, I do believe that there could be some things we don't know and that science is yet to figure it out. But I also believe that the way that, these texts have just been edited over and over again, and there's not really proof, and there's contradictions over and over again.
It's fascinating because you mentioned in your video, Mormons don't drink alcohol. The don't drink alcohol part of the Word of Wisdom they adhere to very strictly, and also the don't drink coffee thing. And with alcohol, they're like, well, now the modern science supports why we shouldn't drink alcohol. And it's like, okay, now the modern science supports that you should eat meat sparingly. When's that bit coming in?
They're like, I do eat meat sparingly. I only eat it 2 or 3 times a day.
Genuinely, though, when Tanner was on his Mormon mission in like the little training center where they feed you, wasn't it just meat for every single meal?
Every single meal, yeah.
Yeah,
that was wild.
Grim.
Oh my gosh, that's ridiculous. Yeah, sparing. That's the problem, is again when you're using subjective words, sparingly, compared to an all carnivore diet, that would be sparingly or whatever. But that should be pretty obvious. That should be pretty obvious that they're eating way too much meat. But again, it's like a high calorie food that people, it's often loaded with salt and fried and stuff, which can be addictive. And it's also seen as, I don't know how much with the Mormon people, but seen as like a class status thing, especially in our parents' generation, previous generations, who then taught us our habits. But yeah, it's funny, after everything we talked about, I'm actually mainly I started going vegan because of health, and then started caring about the animals later. So that is definitely a huge thing. Just the fact that they're eating class 1A carcinogens, which is any processed meat, class 2A carcinogen, any red meat, but pretty much daily probably should be enough to show that their Word of Wisdom is, maybe a little bit more wise than they are.
Why don't you give us a brief overview of the health benefits of going vegan?
So yeah, if a Mormon population cares a lot about health, I do think perhaps that Word of Wisdom thing has a little bit of wisdom, because not only are those meats carcinogenic and contributing to colorectal cancer, we also have a ton of other reasons that animal fat and animal products are not healthy. For example, just the really high saturated fat. And people go vegetarian, they think they're doing a ton of super healthy stuff, but they end up replacing meat with dairy fat. And that is actually already the main source of saturated fat in the US diet, is dairy products like cheese and saturated fat, based off, meta-analyses of clinical trials, controlled feeding trials over and over again. We're seeing more saturated fat, higher cholesterol, and then directly from the European Society of Cardiology, LDL, elevated LDL, bad cholesterol, is causally linked to atherosclerosis, meaning it is causing heart disease, and that's our number one killer. This is all connected with our cardiovascular system, such as erectile dysfunction, which anecdotally, we hear a bunch of people say they reverse when going, especially on a whole food plant-based diet, because you can slam down coconut oil and stuff, which has high saturated fat. But generally, people are eating at least half the amount of saturated fat if they're going on a vegan diet. And then that leads to, pretty much ideal cholesterol levels, especially LDL, where in studies we see the halting of progression of heart disease between like 50 and 70 LDL. So that's where vegans can get, but I have yet to see people who are eating meat get there. Oftentimes people go from like a total cholesterol of 250 or 200 down to 150, which is great. And then beyond that, there's the whole diabetes thing. I have entire videos on how the potential main cause for insulin resistance, which is what is leading to diabetes, is again that animal fat and saturated fat can lead to some toxic products that lead to insulin resistance and makes it so your cells don't take up glucose, and then you have this bad cycle, and those are called intramyocellular lipids, which we don't need to go into now. There's just, but the point is, sorry, the dog is in the background. And that's probably why, you know, from the Adventist studies, we saw a 78% overall lower risk of diabetes for vegans versus people that eat meat. Vegans also average the normal BMI. They're the only diet group that did that. So there's a lot of things that motivated me to go vegan, especially because of our cardiovascular system. And my last point here will be, I have Alzheimer's in my family, and Alzheimer's is essentially clogged brain arteries. There's other things happening as well, but anything I could do to prevent that was very key for me, so I didn't have to go through what I witnessed my grandma go through. Hopefully, you know, knock on wood, you know, we can't control everything, but preventing those brain arteries from clogging is huge, and that's, again, also works with and genitalia, male and female. I have videos on those, you know, everything, you know, skin health and everything, kidney function. It's just your system it's all plumbing. So yeah, that's my health point.
Were you also briefly while you were here, will you also briefly try and sell people on the antioxidant powers of fruits and vegetables?
Oh yeah, for sure. And then another huge thing about heart disease and just how the body ages and everything is oxidative stress. So oxidative stress in our artery can create little lesions. It starts the lesion off. It causes damage on the artery wall, and then you start getting these little fat cell and LDL cholesterol building up with immune cells in your wall. You get those lesions, and then they can, you know, turn into fatty streaks and then larger plaques and then calcify as well. And so if you have a really high antioxidant diet, you're going to prevent that. So you have these essentially free electrons, these free radicals that are doing this damage. They're bouncing around. They are essentially giving pause it. I think I just explained that wrong. Free radicals are ones that have a lack of electrons. So basically you have these free radicals that are lacking electrons, and then they start sucking electrons, literally causing DNA damage and just chain reactions of damage to your cells. And that can cause that artery wall to be impaired. It can cause aging, you know, cancer from DNA damage. You know, that's what's happening with colorectal cancer and meat. Likely is that we're having things like heme iron oxidize in the colon and then causing damage and then leading to DNA mutations, which is not good. So animal products have 1/64th the amount of antioxidants on average that plants do. And so eating a plant-based diet, people are just obviously eating way more antioxidants, and you can go even harder and like just saturate your system more with antioxidants and hopefully prevent disease, slow aging, and not get those lesions or, you know, precancerous sort of DNA damage in your system.
Yeah. Would you say that if for people like us who do live in Salt Lake with horrific air, eating a high antioxidant diet could potentially mitigate some of the impact of that?
I mean, it's hard to tell how much you should be relying on like diet for things like that. There are, you know, promising studies, like airline pilots are exposed to really high levels of atmospheric radiation, which leads to DNA damage. And they did a study where the ones that were eating a higher antioxidant diet didn't show any more DNA damage than the average person. Ones that weren't had way higher DNA damage. I mean, I don't know how much that could affect like lung DNA damage and stuff like that. But I mean, we might just start having to think about like on the days that you know the dust is bad, you know, they should have a dust index and just like maybe wear a mask if you're outside, you know, get an air filter. But it probably isn't, hopefully in the meantime, probably won't be that bad on an average day, right? Because it's dust storm related. But they need to start monitoring it. They need to start letting people know. They need to start working on that public health messaging. And then obviously you have an advantage. Like the more antioxidants in your system, just the more of an advantage you have, period. And the one other piece of information that I think could support that is that people on even a loosely plant-based diet had like 73% lower chance of moderate to severe COVID. And that is lung related, obviously. And so it's possible that having less, you know, pulmonary artery fatty streaks and stuff, you're going to get more antioxidant sort of potential in your lungs. I don't really know. I haven't looked into that, so I don't want to make any main claims on that. But yeah, it can't hurt to eat more antioxidants.
There
Yeah.
are so many reasons to eat vegan, whether it's for your own personal health, environmental health, or just the compassion toward other sentient beings and recognizing, oh, we don't have to like torture and make the lives miserable of these animals that are quite sentient and
only exist because we've brought them into existence to torture them and have a
Yeah.
miserable life.
For sure. It is a strong case for karma, which again, I'm like agnostic, but like, don't hurt the animals, don't get as hurt. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and hopefully inspiring some people towards some meaningful action,
Yeah.
which is what we're trying to do. Everyone watching, go follow Mike the Vegan on YouTube.
Yeah, MIC the Vegan, and I'm on a bunch of different platforms. I'm like trying to do more TikTok. In fact, I just posted a video about the Great Salt Lake, 2 little shorter videos about the Great Salt Lake on TikTok, and they got like almost no views. So I'm gonna try to post more consistently on there. And of course, I have Facebook and Instagram and blah blah. So yeah, thanks so much for having me, and yeah, spread the word about the Great Salt Lake, and hopefully can stop things sooner than later. All right. Okay, I'm gonna cut it off.